long periods and transitional years. Are you ready for another election year? 2020 is just around the corner and anxiety is already in the air. Just yesterday at HEB, I saw a gentleman wearing his "Re-elect Trump in 2020" t-shirt. And I thought, oh boy, here it is again. Election years are some of the most difficult years in our nation. And doesn't it seem that every election gets uglier and uglier? All the rhetoric and the foul language. But maybe it's always been that way. I read this statement recently about a political presidential candidate. Murder, robbery, rape, adultery, and incest will be openly taught and practiced. The air will be rent with the cries of the distressed, the soil soaked with blood, and the nation black with crimes. Where is the heart that can contemplate such a scene without shivering in horror? Can you guess the presidential candidate to which this bleak accusation refers? It wasn't about O'Rourke, and it wasn't about Donald Trump. It was written by the New England Current on the election of Thomas Jefferson in the year 1800. Yeah, so brace yourselves. Election years have always been difficult years for our nation. They're difficult years because they are transitional years following what feels to be long periods. They're transitional years because the power pendulum could suddenly swing in the opposite direction. The political seesaw could suddenly shift. Everything seems to be up in the air depending on where you stand. Election years can be good or bad. For a group of Israelite slaves languishing under the thumb of Egyptian oppression, an election year sparks opportunity for hope. We're in a series called "And God Remembered." For those of you who have been out or are new, we are doing this series by examining scriptures where God uses that specific phrase. So far, God has remembered Noah and the animals and therefore decides never to flood the world again because He remembered. He remembers Abraham and so spares Lot and his family from the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. He remembered Rachel and allowed her to conceive a child and provided for her future. Today in Exodus chapter 2, verses 23 through 25, we see God doing the same thing for a different group of people. Exodus chapter 2, verses 23 through 25. During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard the groaning, and He remembered His covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. This is the word of the Lord. Praise be to God. During that long period, our passage says, the king of Egypt died. That's what sets the stage. Did you hear it? It's a transitional year following a long period. After a long period, a new king is set to come and rule over Egypt. And the question on every Hebrew person's mind is, what will happen to us when the new king gets here? You see, depending on where you stand, election years can be good or bad. And we today are no strangers to long periods and transitional years. We are no stranger to that long period between separation and divorce. Did you hear that they've separated? No, I didn't hear that. Is everything okay? Oh, we don't know. We're just going to have to wait and see. It's a long period between separation and divorce. We're no stranger to the long period between diagnosis and remedy. As many of you already know, Dan Mohan's cancer has returned and also is spreading. MD Anderson is trying to get him in a program that could help him, but beyond that, there's no clear path. So I pray that you will lift up Dan and Manon during this difficult time, because it's going to be a transitional year in the Mohan home. Amy and I are no stranger to that long period between pregnancy and delivery. Chandler baby, number 2, coming this August. We're excited and anxious to meet our new addition, but until then, we'll just have to endure the long period. Yeah, lots to do around the Chandler house right about now. There's a sign-up sheet in the lobby. Yeah. And you know what I've discovered about those long periods and transitional years? They're suspenseful. A lot of uncertainty in long periods and transitional years. For better or for worse, anxiety goes hand in hand with long periods and transitional years. Questions abound. Have I done something wrong? Is this my fault? What can I do to fix this? Where is this going to end? Where is God? Has God forgotten about me? Yeah, that's the tricky thing with saying, and God remembered. It also implies that God forgot. And forgetting can start to feel, after a while, a whole lot like forsaking. Has God forgotten me? Turns into, has God forsaken me? But it's an election year. Depending on where you stand, that can be good or bad. During that long period, the king of Egypt died. And a new king is set to come. The true king is coming. And our passage reveals many things about this new king. He is a king who hears. He is a king who sees. He is a king who knows. He is a king who remembers. And based on this new king, there's a lot of opportunity for hope. Our passage first points out that he is the king who hears. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help went up to God. Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann says that this cry of hurt and rage, that's how he describes it, a cry of hurt and rage, is the catalyst for the entire Exodus story. It is the cry that evokes God's care. And the Jewish people are well accustomed to this form of prayer. Over half of the Psalms, in the book of Psalms, over half of them are complaint psalms. Over half of them complaining. Take Psalm 42, which begins, I cry aloud to the Lord, I lift up my voice to the Lord for mercy, I pour out before Him my complaint. Before Him I tell my trouble. Are we allowed to talk to God that way? Yes. According to Exodus chapter 2 and according to Psalm 142, yes. You are allowed to cry out to God. You are allowed to express your grief and pain and hurt and anger to God when life isn't going your way. You are allowed to talk to God the way Tevye does in Fiddler on the Roof. Take a look at this clip.
So you'll find me here, my brethren. I'll talk to you later.
That's good, Jeff. Thank you. That's got to be one of the best lines in cinema. What have you got against my horse? Life feels that way, though, sometimes, doesn't it? But do you know why we can talk to God that way? Do you know why we're allowed to talk to God just like you saw Tevye do? It's because He's the God who hears. Walter Brueggemann says that there's just something about this God that makes hearing possible. In other words, it's in His very character and His very nature to want to listen to the cries of His children. He wants to hear you talk with Him. And even in the New Testament, this is true. Paul says in Romans 8:26, in the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit Himself intercedes for us through wordless groans. I don't know about you, but I've had a few prayers in my life that were nothing more but wordless groans. But He is the King who hears. Don't stifle your voice. Don't stifle that grief and hurt and rage and pain. Don't stifle your prayers in those long periods and transitional years. Let your cries be made known to God, because He wants to listen. And who knows? Who knows? Just like these Israelites, that prayer could be the catalyst that provokes God's care. But not only does the new king hear, he also sees. Our passage says, so God looked on the Israelites. This new king has vision. And any king who has vision is a king worth following. When I was a 19-year-old youth minister, I didn't know what I was doing. One summer, I was working at a small Baptist church in Christine, Texas. Do any of you know where Christine, Texas is? That's okay, nobody else does either. A little over an hour away was an older and much more experienced youth minister named Randy. Randy was the youth minister at First Baptist Church of Hondo in Hondo, Texas, where my brother was the pastor at the time. During that summer, Randy had a brilliant idea that he suckered me into. He wanted his students to get a hands-on illustration of what the Christian life was really like. And so he thought the Christian life is kind of like a journey. And it is, right? The Christian life is kind of like this journey that we're traveling. And so he thought, wouldn't it be neat if we could get all of our students to go on an actual physical journey that somehow matched also our spiritual journey? Here was Randy's plan. First, he decided not to tell any of the students or parents what was going on. 100% secrecy in this journey plan. He had volunteers drop the students off at a gas station in Dehennis, Texas, with a duffel bag full of random heavy objects. Then the volunteers took off, and they left all of us stranded at this gas station. It was only then that Randy announced his plan. We were all going to walk from Dehennis, Texas, all the way back to Hondo, 10 miles. His rules were simple. One, you couldn't ask any questions. At no point could you ask Randy what's going on. Rule number 2, you could quit at any time you want. You could quit, no questions asked, and a volunteer would come pick you up and take you back home. But for those who made it to the very end, there was a reward. He didn't tell anybody what the reward was, but it turned out it was a massive pool party, inflatable barbecue. This is the craziest youth party you ever see. You see what he's trying to do? The journey, and at the end is heaven, this big reward. He's trying to get us to go on a journey. So 100 students set out. And along the way, Randy had several meaningful stops. At one point, Randy provided ice-cold water for everybody. And he said that Jesus is the water of life. And then he shared the gospel with everyone. At another point, some volunteers pulled up and they took away all those heavy duffel bags full of random objects. Randy said, Jesus takes away your burdens. But the part of the journey that got Randy in trouble was when he blindfolded everybody and made them hold on to the shoulders of the student in front of them. And we made a giant train. The only person who wasn't blindfolded was Randy, who walked at the head of the group. He marched 100 students down the side of Highway 90 from D'Hanis to Hondo for several miles. Needless to say, the parents weren't impressed. But his point was effective. Often in our Christian life, the only person who can see where we're going is God. Can you still trust and follow the King? Even in those long periods and in those transitional years when you can't see where you're going. I'm beginning to like this new king. He hears, he sees. Perhaps this election year won't be that bad after all. Our passage also says that he knows. The NIV translators try to help out some awkwardness in the text. If you notice, they say he was concerned about them, but that's not what the Hebrew says. The Hebrew writers finish Exodus 2 simply by stating, and God knew. That's it. There's no object. It doesn't refer to anything in specific, and God knew. That's how it ends. It leaves us wondering, well, and God knew what? What did God know? I think what the Hebrew writer is trying to express is that God isn't surprised. God wasn't surprised by anything the Israelites were going through. The truth about God is that He doesn't forget. He doesn't forget anything we're going through. Even before the Israelites cry out to God, God knew. The psalm that expresses the idea best is Psalm 139, which says, "You have searched me, and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You are familiar with all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you, Lord, know it completely. You hem me in behind and before. You lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too lofty for me to attain." God knows. God knows everything about you. He knows everything you're going through. He knows exactly how to fix whatever problem you are facing. What we need to do then is listen to the God who knows. A woman left her diamond brooch in a hotel room. When she got back home, she discovered that it was missing. Panicked, she called the hotel. She told the manager what happened, and he went to look for it. After some time, he found it, and he returned to the phone to tell her the good news. But by then, she had already hung up the phone. How many times have we been impatient during those long periods and transitional years? How many times have we been impatient with God and hung up the phone? We would do better to stay on the line. For how long? As long as it takes. Stay on the line with God as long as it takes. Because He is the one, the only one who truly knows. Lastly, He is the King who remembers. God remembers His covenant with Abraham, with Isaac and Jacob. As Brueggemann puts it, He connects present slaves with past promises, and He does the same for us today. But it isn't the promise with Abraham that God remembers. It's the promise that He made to us through His Son, Jesus Christ. Jesus, the only person in the history of the world that God forgot. My God, He cried out on the cross, why have you forsaken me? Through the cross, the wrath of God was satisfied. On the cross, the Son of God forgotten. But through the resurrection, God has also remembered. Karen Harchuk's son, Tyler, died on August 21st, 2018. I was at my home at the time. She texted me, Ryan, I need you to come here now, please. The funeral came and went Monday, August 27th. I returned to the church office. I noticed that our church calendar that we have sitting in there was still on August 21st. As if time had been standing still ever since Tyler died. For Ken and Karen, it was. Time is standing still. It is always August 21st for Ken and Karen. They found themselves on that day suddenly thrust in the middle of a long period and transitional year. When I saw that calendar, I took a picture of that day. And I texted that picture to Karen. And I said, because of the resurrection power in Jesus, it won't be August 21st forever. Because of the resurrection power of Jesus, you will not forever remain in your long period or in a transitional year. That's the promise. That's the promise that God remembers when He looks on you today, when He sees you, when He hears you. Because God knows and God remembers. So I guess this election year won't be all that bad. Oh, well, it depends. It all depends on who your king is. For those of us who have made Jesus Christ our King, it means hope. Hope that the long period will not last forever. Hope that the transitional year ends in Jubilee Hope. Because He is the King who hears. Hope. Because He is the King who sees. Hope. Because He is the King who knows. Hope. Because He is the King who remembers. In Christ alone, my hope is found. He is my light, my strength, my song. This cornerstone, this solid ground, firm through the fiercest drought and storm. What heights of love, what depths of peace, when fears are stilled, when strivings cease. My comforter, my all in all, here in the love of Christ I stand. Will you pray with me?